Hi, and welcome to The Golden Age, an introduction to the classic era of detective literature. The term the Golden Age refers to both a time period and a style of detective fiction. And since we are reading a piece that takes place in the Golden Age that was published in the Golden Age and illustrates the Golden Age style, we're going to take a step back to learn a bit more about both the era and the style. So, the Golden Age is a term for detective fiction, particularly British detective fiction, that was published in the 1920s to 1930s. It marks a period of time with huge growth in this genre, both in its popularity and sales, right? Tons of sales of detective fiction during this time, but also this set the foundation for the development of the form. A lot of the ways we think of detective fiction now was really defined in the Golden Age. Generally speaking, this period is seen as beginning with the end of World War I in 1918 and ending in the beginning of World War II, which in Europe started with Germany's invasion of Poland, which happened in 1939. So as you can see, this is a small time period that we consider the Golden Age, and yet it had a huge amount of influence on detective literature. Agatha Christie's novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, published in 1920, is seen as the first important work of the Golden Age style. Now, as we saw before in a previous video, many writers have been writing detective stories, but when this book came out, its success and style marked a change in the way we approach detective fiction. Part of this change came from an even more increased focus of the mystery. You see the word mysterious in the title. It is built in that the mystery is central here. That the mysterious nature of the story is the engine that's going to push you forward. This style of book became known as kind of the puzzles. These are, because the puzzle of the story, the solving of that took center stage to the exclusion or de-emphasis of factors like character development or theme. These were not books that were big on symbolism or big on, fancy language or literary, figurative language, literary devices like that. These are stories that focused on the puzzle of solving the mystery. Agatha Christie was born in 1890 in Devon, England. She wrote more than 75 detective novels and short story collections, dramas, romances under her pen name Mary Westmacott, and nonfiction. She's best known as a mystery writer, particularly her books following one of her two big characters, Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple. In fact, to this day, she is tied with Shakespeare as the best-selling writer of all time. It helps when you've written so many books to get to be bestseller. And Agatha Christie certainly was very prolific, meaning she wrote a lot of books. Like Christie, many of the foremost writers of this style were British, and they were women, like Dorothy Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, and Ngaio Marsh. Forgive me sometimes I stumble over that word, Ngaio Marsh. She was from New Zealand, but lived much of her life in Britain. These four are often called the queens of crime. And part of that's because up until now, with a few important exceptions, detective stories had really been a man's game. Now, there could be many reasons that the most prominent writers of Golden Age style became women. Part of it might be that World War I claimed a lot of lives, most of which were male. There was huge amounts of life lost there. Also, lending libraries, the way we think of libraries now is a place where you could go check out a book and take it home. Those were growing in popularity and mostly among female readers. Now, of course, many male writers saw success during this period. G.K. Chesterton, John Dickerson Carr, those are just a couple. But it was these women who had the biggest influence on the style. The style of detective novels that came out of this period, the style that we know as the Golden Age, has persisted far past it. People write books today that are still considered Golden Age type mysteries. But these women predominantly, and the other writers during this time period, they're the ones who made it happen. So let's talk a little bit about this style. Golden Age detective stories typically contain many traits that define the style. There are, of course, countless exceptions. Any great Golden Age detective story will probably violate some of these. But these are the most common characteristics, the things that kind of qualify a work as being seen as the Golden Age style. First, murder is the most central crime. While some stories, particularly the short stories from this time period, focus on crimes like jewel theft or kidnapping, the majority focused on this most heinous of crimes. Murder became the most common crime to write about. The settings for these stories were typically enclosed in some way. That could mean a small village, maybe a single house. In Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, it was a couple train cars. Everything happened within this train car, a couple train cars right next to each other. The stereotype is the English manor house that you see in that photo. But in any case, it's a closed setting. That means it's not in the middle of the street in a busy city. It's somewhere where it's all kind of a little claustrophobic feeling and a small setting. You don't have far to travel to get to all the parts of it. And with that closed setting, it allows for a more defined list of suspects. The only possible guilty party has to be among a limited number of people who had access to that closed setting. So if the murder happened on a train car while the train was in motion, then the guilty party has to be from among the people that were on that train. If it's in a manor house, if they're snowed in for the weekend, then it has to be the people that were in the house that time. The closed setting gives us a defined list of suspects. From the people who are on that suspect list, all are potentially guilty. So that means that all have a motive, though we probably don't know it right away. We learn that all the suspects that were there had a motive, and to varying degrees, all had the opportunity. So that means from the beginning, we're dealing with the thought that it could be any of the people in this closed list of suspects. It's going to be at least one of them, but it's could be any of them. The story is also socially closed. By that I mean we get very little interaction with people from lower socioeconomic classes. The criminal typically comes from the same class as the victim, and that's usually a higher socioeconomic class. A servant's class comes onto the scene at times, but they very rarely turn out to be the guilty party. Also, that career criminal, the outlaw, the person who's been doing this for a long time, that's relatively rare in the Golden Age style. All suspects, at least on the surface, at least at the beginning, appear to be respectable members of middle to upper class society. So we get to watch the rich and famous, the rich and powerful and beautiful. They're the bad guys. There's not much interaction or movement outside of that socioeconomic class. The victim will typically be someone wealthy and someone who we learn over time, if we didn't know it right away, is kind of hated. Somebody that nobody particularly likes, kind of going back to the idea that all the suspects have a motive for wanting this person dead. It's usually that person is a pretty terrible person. That gives us, the more potential suspects, more reasons people would want them dead, and very little, if any, mourning of the dead. So one thing to note about Golden Age style is that the story as a whole and the characters within it, we don't spend much time on their emotion. We don't mourn the dead. We're not talking about the loss of them or what it really means to people. We don't get the sense that anybody's life is really ruined by this person's death. In some cases, a lot of people's lives get better. And on top of that, in addition to avoiding the emotional sides of murder and the consequences of murder, We also don't get many graphic details about the murder. We typically don't see the crime happen on the page. We enter the story after the murder's happened, or we get a little bit before it's happened, and then somebody finds the body. We're not usually in the room to watch it happen. And most of the murders are bloodless, meaning they're poisonings, hangings, bumps on the head. There's usually not a lot of gore, if any. We spend no time really describing a bloody scene. It's very tidy, very clean. And we spend no time thinking about the emotional or mental effects of the crime at all. Again, respectability, right? Where this is all very clean. It's the puzzle, not the graphic nature of the crime.